Lecture 4, Camus, the Plague and the Fall.
Camus considered himself a humanist, and I think in the best sense of the term, he certainly was one. So far, the works we've been talking about portray Camus as a person who is concerned primarily with very individual personal issues. And one could, I think, rightly complain that the picture we get of Marceau in The Stranger, the picture we get of Sisyphus in The Myth of Sisyphus, they're both about isolated individuals who don't really relate to the society around them. Sisyphus didn't have a society around him. There's a lack of a social dimension, and that certainly doesn't jive with the idea that Camus himself was very much a political, social animal. The novel I'd like to talk about next, therefore, corrects this misimpression, because as a humanist, Camus was always concerned with our place among our obligation to other people. The novel is The Plague, and it was written also during the Second World War, although published shortly after. It was set in the south of France, and one can interpret it on a number of levels, like any novel. The story, very simply, is that in the setting of the novel, which is, again, in Algiers, what we find is that in a city, the plague appears, there's an enormous number of dead rats, it gets more serious, people start dying, they quarantine the city, no one's allowed out, and by the end of the novel, the plague has started to wane, its effects are lightening. What happens in the novel, basically, is that we trace the behavior of a bunch of characters who have very different reactions to this absurd situation. Now, I said Camus himself wrote the novel in southern France, and that gives rise to one quite obvious interpretation, namely the plague is the Nazi occupation. And as a kind of comparison, one thinks of some recent books. In particular, I'm thinking of Philip Howey's Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, which is an account, a true account, of the behavior of some of those southern French Huguenots in the face of the Nazi occupation, who made a full-time job out of essentially helping Jews to escape from the Holocaust. One can read The Plague, Camus' novel, in precisely that way. But I think that, too, is too easy an account. And the reason it's too easy is because the Nazi occupation, one hopes, is not a regular occurrence. It's something that happened once in history, and although there are other similar atrocities, one hopes that it's not going to be something we will soon have to face again. I think the plague has a much more general interpretation, and that's the one I'd like to pursue here. And that is, the plague is nothing other than human life itself. The fact that, as he has said in each of his novels so far, we're all going to die. We don't know exactly when. Death is, in a way, fickle, uncaring. It picks us without regard to merit, desert, or anything else. And so, too, the plague in the novel, it simply knocks people off without regard to who they are or their goodness or anything else. In fact, one of the people who was killed by the plague fairly early on is precisely the quite religious minister who takes the plague to be a warning from God, a kind of punishment for sins, and so on. One would think that his voice would be the last to be stilled on a typical religious interpretation. Instead, it's one of the first. So what we get in this series of characters is, among other things, the varieties of reactions to life itself. We find heroes, although in some cases they're quite unexpected, as I will show. There are those who simply want to take advantage of a bad situation, so of course we have the profiteers and the crooks. There are those who simply want to escape. One young visitor is caught in the quarantine city with his wife on the outside, and all he thinks about for the majority of the novel is getting away. There is black humor in such an occasion, and one character who is probably the most likable single character in the novel is full of jokes and ironic twists which suggests that the way to get through life is presumably to have a sense of humor about it. But the two characters that are worth talking about are the two people who might be able to qualify as heroes in the novel. One, who deserves the most attention, is a doctor. He is also caught in the city with his wife on the outside. He realizes that there is actually nothing that can be done about the plague. There is no cure, there is no preventative. What he faces, in other words, is very much like the situation that Sisyphus faces in the myth, namely an impossible situation in which there is nothing to be done to bring about any kind of desirable result, and instead what he has to do is simply face up to that fact. His heroism lies precisely in the fact that he refuses to give up. He says at several points in the novel, okay, all we can really do is count bodies and bury the dead. We can keep track of the plague and see if there's any kind of comfort we can give, but ultimately there's no cure, there's nothing to do. And so it is in life itself. And Camus saw himself against many of his ideological friends in France. He saw himself always taking the line, of course we can't eradicate human evil and human suffering, but the important thing is always just to do what we can. And that, I think, is perhaps the most sympathetic interpretation of the kind of rebellion we talked about in the last lecture, namely that what you can do, you do, but don't expect to get any great results, but don't give up either. The other hero, and I use the word with some trepidation in the novel, and I actually would come to that conclusion only because Camus himself suggests that he is the hero of the novel, is a perfectly ordinary man named Mr. Grand. The name, of course, is ironic. Grand is in many ways a good deal like Meursault in The Stranger in his ordinariness, in his simplicity, in the sense that he really just goes through a very humdrum life without complaint, without thinking ever very big. His one bit of transcendence, if you like, is that he tries to write a novel. In fact, he's working on the novel throughout the entire novel, The Plague. He only gets to the end of the first sentence. He plays with it in various ways through the course of the novel, changing adjectives, changing ways of putting things, and he finally decides to shorten the sentence to 3 words, and that's kind of where his novel gets left. We can expect it never gets done. What makes him a hero is that he is a perfectly ordinary person who, realizing the horror of the plague, simply refuses to fall into despair. He insists on helping the doctor at every opportunity, and the message here, again, is you do what you can for your fellow human beings. You don't ask for a justification. You don't ask if, in fact, you really do make a difference in some larger way. It's simply facing up to the fact that life is unfair, the fact that we are all going to die, and simply accepting the fact at face value without flinching.